Hello, I'm Roger Bisbee from the Skill Builder channel, and in this video I want to do a bit of stud walling, but I'm not going to be using timber. I'm going to be using Knauf's metal stud walling, which is quicker and easier. So let's see how I get on. So with any stud wall you need a sole plate on the floor and you need a header at the top, and basically in between that is where you put your studs. Now when I fix this to this particular floor, I'm just going to drill and screw straight into the floor. If you've got some unevenness, if you want to level the floor up, you can do that by putting down a bit of timber sole plate if you like, first of all, just to lift this off. And also if you've got any kind of damp in the floor, it's a good idea to run a bit of DPC under the sole plate before you fix it down. So when you're setting out a stud wall, it's worth spending a bit of time measuring up so you make sure that it's parallel and square. If you're trying to get something square to a corner, for example, we use the 3-4-5 trick. Now I'll just show you, you would measure out 30 on here, 40 on there, and if it's square, that measurement between those 2 points would be 50. If it's not, you move it out or you move it in until it is 50. Then you'll be sure it's absolutely square. But in this case, we've got the tiles. We're running with the tiles because they're square. I've already checked that, so I can just parallel that line up with these tiles and we should be fine. In this particular wall, we're going to need a doorway, so I'm going to cut the opening for the doorway, allowing for the timber door liner to go in before the door. So there's my opening, 44 inches is there. So there's the floor channel, and then we just go like that. So when you're doing a doorway, you need to put screws very close to the edge of the door, but also go back 150 millimeters, just so that end is not going to wave about anywhere. Now the great thing about doing this Knauf metal stud walling is you don't need to be too precise with the studs. If we leave 5 millimeters, 3 to 5 millimeters, that's absolutely perfect. And that actually allows for a little bit of deflection. Having that little bit of give, if you like, is a good thing. You can do it with ordinary track. This is the same track that I used on the base, and that would work in this situation. But I also want to show you this, which is a much deeper track, and that allows you to have a greater deflection. What we do first of all is we back that up with a bit of plasterboard. Now if this is a fire rated wall, then obviously you want to use pink board on that, but in this case it isn't, so we can just put an ordinary piece of plasterboard on the back of this before we put it on the ceiling, and you'll see why we do that. Now you'll notice that this C-section stud has got holes in here, and this is so that you can pass surfaces through cables, pipes, things like that. If you measure out and it so happens that your measurement comes on one of these cutouts, you don't want to be cutting the channel there, so move it up, do it there and cut a little bit off the end so that you're free of it. Now it's time for me to fix the ceiling track in place, and it's always great if you can find some kind of timber, some kind of joist or noggin or something to fix the track to. And over the years I've owned a great many joist stud finders, those kind of things, but this is my go-to thing. Requires no batteries, little magnet, and I just move it around here, and then eventually, oh look, I find a fixing. Now, normally when you're setting the studs out, you would go 600 centers. So if you're using a 1200 wide board, that works out perfectly for you. You'll have a join on a stud. If you're in a bathroom, you want to go to 400 centers because you've got the weight of the tiles. You want to just make it a little bit more rigid so you don't get any grout cracking. So in this case, I've only got 1000 millimeters there, so I'm going to stick the stud smack bang in the middle. But if you're doing a longer wall and you've got 1200 boards going along, make sure you don't have two boards joining on the same stud. In other words, if you were doing this, you would cut your first board to 600 if that was how it was spaced. Then you would go the long board on that side, you'd have a long board on that side, so that way you make sure that you're staggering your joints. Now, if you go strictly by the rule books, by the guidance, if you like, you don't need to put this second row of screws in here. You can just put the ones in at the end, unless you're dealing in a commercial situation. But I really just like to do that because it's only a couple of screws. It beefs it up at the end, makes it really rigid at the end. And if we're hanging a door on here, it could be at some point that somebody wants to put an oak door on there, something heavy, and you know, doors slam and all the rest of it. So just having that bit of extra rigidity around any door opening, to me, is worthwhile. So this is the stud wall assembled. Now you can just see what I'm talking about with the deflection is that we've left this 15 millimeters of space above the stud. It's still well into that channel because we're using the deep channel for the deflection head. But the idea is that if there's any movement on that floor above, or if there was any movement on the floor underneath, it wouldn't buckle the wall. The whole thing would be able to move up minutely up and down without causing any kind of cracking on the plasterboard. So if you need a deflection head, you don't always, but if you do, then it's important to get that detail right. Having done that, we haven't fixed the studs. So the first thing I need to do is to set the studs out according to the plasterboard. Now, you never finish up with two cuts on the same stud. In other words, you're cutting your boards in, stagger them so that this one is longer and that one shorter, so that it's always moving across. So I've got the first piece of board here and I've cut it and I've left a gap. Now the gap is important. We don't want to put plasterboard on the floor. We also need that gap at the top if we're doing a deflection head, because what we want to allow for is the ceiling to come down and just slide, if you like, on these studs. So I've just pinned that piece of plasterboard to the first stud, one screw going through. I can now position this stud halfway onto the plasterboard. And normally with any stud wall I'd put insulation in there because it helps with sound deadening, it helps with fire resistance, and it's a great idea to get yourself some Knauf insulation and roll it in there. But I'm not going to do it now because it's just a demo wall and I don't really want to have the insulation obscuring what I'm doing. Our next board's going to go in all the way to the door edge. When I go to the door edge, I'm not going to cut the board, I'm just going to run the board over, and you'll see why in a minute. Now when it comes to screwing the plasterboard to the studs, we want to be going every 300 millimeters, so that's roughly 300 millimeters. So here's a common mistake that I make and other people make, you see it all the time, is that if you drive too deeply, you break the paper face of the board and that reduces the fixing power. So we want to leave that paper face intact. So we set the adjustment on the screw gun so that we're just going in, but we need to go in enough because when it comes to doing the filling here, the taping and jointing, we don't want screws to be hitting our filling knife all the way. So once you get it set up, nothing should change. So now I can put a stud in place to fix the end of the board, but what I mustn't do is fix into this channel here. I can fix into this one, but because of this deflection, we need to leave this channel to be able to slide up and down slightly. So that movement, it means that we're not going to fix any fixings above that margin there. So just to make sure, we can see that plus the plasterboard bring us to about there. So that would be our top fixing for the stud. And now you can see why I fixed that plasterboard to the ceiling track, the channel, before I fixed it, because what we will now do is put a mastic in along there. The mastic will still allow the deflection to take place. We don't overfill it with the mastic, but what that does is it stops any kind of sound transmission. And if it were fire, we were doing that with a pink board or maybe 2 layers of board. But the idea is that we want to block that passage for fire to get through there.
Nice.
So when you're hanging a door, it pays to reinforce these studs with a piece of timber infill inside. You can use anything you've got, battens or cut a piece to size. I tend to do the post as well, so that people have got an option of which side they want to hang the door, because sometimes they change their mind. Start it going one way and then decide they want it to go the other. It can never do any harm to put an extra bit of timber in just to make sure. So there you are, that's just a brief introduction on how to fit Knauf Performer partitions. So now it's ready for taping and jointing and putting in the door lining, and you can see that I've put that mastic along the top just to sound deaden it, stop anything going through, but you never want to overfill that. It's important that we keep that deflection head a little bit flexible. If you want more information, go to their website, there's more technical information, but this gives you the basics, and I hope you can see just how quick and easy it is to fit.